There are places where the line between land and life blurs so completely that a map feels inadequate. Houses that breathe with the tide, markets that float like slow constellations, schools reached by skiff and scaffold. To enter these communities is to learn that living beside water is not simply a condition, but a conversation, with seasons, with salt, with memory. Stay with this journey until the end. Subscribe for more stories like this and tap the bell so these voices keep reaching new shores. The first light on Inle Lake comes thin as rice paper. Morning folds over the water in a flat silver plain, pierced by the silhouettes of men standing at the stern of long wooden boats, balancing a leg and an oar in a practiced choreography that seems to come from the bones. Houses on stilts lean toward one another, linked by narrow walkways and the soft commerce of a day beginning. Baskets of tomatoes bobbing like small suns. Women threading nets into the shade. A child learning to hold a pole like a promise. The lake is a mirror that remembers altitude. At 600 meters, the air is cool and the water carries the scent of damp leaves and smoke from kitchens where rice steams in clay pots. Life here is arranged around buoyancy. Floating gardens, beds of woven reeds and mud, unfurl like patches sewn to the surface. And men and women bend over them, tending greens with a patient urgency. The gardens are both engineering and ritual. Their textures, dark and slick, are the product of generations who learn to coax fertility from a water body that rises and falls with the seasons. A teacher in a cluster of stilted classrooms calls out arithmetic across the water, her voice swallowed and returned by the lake. Children paddle in hand-me-down boats, skipping school only when the weather swallows a morning. Further east, Tonle Sap is a different kind of lung. In the wet season, the river turns into a vast inland sea. In the dry season, it retreats, revealing a network of channels and mudflats where families have adapted their rhythms to one of Asia's most dramatic hydrological reversals. Floating villages migrate with the flood. Houses tether like yachts to the ebb and flow. Markets unmoor and refloat. Schools are framed by life jackets and plastic tarps. A fisherman, silhouetted against the horizon of stilt-house roofs, explains in a few succinct phrases how the rising waters bring both bounty and risk. Fish, yes, but also the slow erosion of foundations and the need to lift possessions higher each year. His voice is matter-of-fact, the language of someone who has learned to measure time by waterline. Across continents, on Lake Titicaca, the Uros Islands sit like anarchic constellations of reed. They are built from totora, layered and lashed until the island is thick enough to support a home, a shop, a ceremony. Underfoot, the reeds compress, releasing a damp, sweet scent. Above, the wind designs small waves on the lake, as if translating messages between islands. The people who live here have cultivated a practice of maintenance so intimate it resembles worship. Islands are perpetually under repair, threads of life visible at the seams. Tourists arrive with cameras and questions, and hosts offer recountings that balance hospitality with careful ownership of their stories. The Uros are neither museum exhibits nor curiosities. They are communities that insist on being seen as continuing, adaptive, and present. Out on the Gulf of Guinea, Ganvi is built on stilts so extensive that from a distance the village dissolves into a forest of posts and roofs above water. Canoes cut through the alleys, and children learn navigation before they learn to read maps of land. Trade here is kinetic. Fish are traded for goods, prayers are delivered to shrines set on platforms, and governance happens in the shade of community leaders who know each channel by name. The stilted architecture is both response and refuge, born of a past that sought protection from invasions, and a present that negotiates both tourism and threats of relocation. Conversations about future plans often begin with the practical. Where will a market go if a new levee is built? And end with questions about dignity. In Lagos, Makoko occupies a liminal space between urban ambition and informal ingenuity. Here, platforms and shanties articulate an economy of adaptation, where carpenters repurpose scrap, families run informal schools under corrugated roofs, and the water is both survival and hazard. It is easy to imagine Makoko as purely emblematic of urban neglect. It is more accurate to see it as a complex ecosystem in which jobs, kinship, and resourcefulness intertwine. Children play at the water's edge with a boldness that suggests both joy and precarity. An elder who has lived through repeated eviction rumors and municipal plans says, without rancor but with a tired steadiness, that people will always find ways to make a home. But not everyone is asked whether they want to be left with nowhere but the water. Along the shores of West Africa and Southeast Asia, the Bajau, the sea nomads, embody a relationship to the ocean that most urban planners cannot imagine. For many Bajau communities, life is organized on and above the surface. Houses on stilts, boats that serve as bedrooms and schools, and a knowledge system that reads currents, fish migrations, and reef health like scripture. Free divers in some Bajau communities can descend and retrieve coconut crabs and sponges without modern equipment, their lungs and bodies honed by ancestral practice. Yet, that intimacy also exposes them. As reef ecosystems decline and fishing pressures increase, the Bajau face a double challenge of ecological loss and legal marginalization in nation-states that prize static borders and fixed addresses over fluid life. Small scale, high resilience. These are recurring themes. Nzulezo, for example, a village in West Africa built on stilts in a small lagoon, organizes daily life around narrow planks and laddered access. School desks line up under thatch roofs. Women pound cassava on platforms while the children fish for sustenance close at hand. Rainwater is collected in barrels. Solar panels, when funds allow, dot a few roofs like modest hopes. The community is keenly aware of vulnerability, and the language of adaptation is practical. Raise the plinths, reinforce the posts, diversify food sources. Yet there is also a deeper art in these practices, an artistry born of continuity. Halong Bay is an archipelago of karst towers rising from the sea, their silhouettes at dawn resembling an ink-scattered landscape. Floating houses and fishing platforms sit in sheltered coves. Aquaculture farms blot the surface with neat grids of cages. The scenery attracts visitors, and with them the economics of tourism, which brings both cash and the pressure to commodify. Local fishers find their seasons shortened by boat traffic, their lines tangled in the wake of leisure yachts. Here, the conversation about the future of water communities folds into global questions: how to balance income generation with the preservation of ways of living that depend on quiet waters and healthy reefs. Mabul, a small Malaysian island known to divers for its marine biodiversity, hosts communities whose livelihoods are entangled with the sea's health. Guest houses cluster along a narrow shoreline. In the mornings, the smell of fish grilling mixes with the iodine tang of debris. Divers speak of coral mantles and sudden encounters with manta rays. Locals speak of declines, ambiguous, gradual, and often patchy, in catches. Solutions here are pursued in partnership: coral restoration projects, community-run conservation areas, and the training of young people as dive guides who also serve as custodians of knowledge about currents and reef life cycles. On the edge of capital cities, projects with grand names, Oceanic Bosun, Malay 2100, floating prototypes in wealthy coastal states, present a different future. Engineered platforms, luxury floating neighborhoods, and municipal plans that imagine cities capable of rising with the tides. These are visions of possibility and points of ethical friction. They promise resilience, but also risk entrenching a two-tier future in which those who can pay remain on elevated comforts, while marginalized communities shoulder the brunt of relocation or loss. The technical language perfused through planning documents, modular platforms, ballast systems, desalination units, hides social questions that are harder to engineer. Who gets to choose and who pays? For conversations with urban planners and local leaders often sound like attempts to reconcile two languages, engineering's metrics and a community's lived geographies. A planner may describe a floating neighborhood as a proof of concept, emphasizing energy self-sufficiency and storm resilience. A mother in a stilted village will ask whether her children will be able to keep their way of life or whether they will be moved to a concrete suburb with unfamiliar schools and distant jobs. Technology can be a bridge, but without equitable governance, it can also be a new form of exclusion. At the center of many stories are micro-innovators, carpenters who adjust the geometry of stilts to better resist swell, women who develop small-scale aquaponics on floating rafts, school teachers who create curriculum on boats so that pupils learn alongside livelihoods. These are the often invisible acts that transform vulnerability into capacity. In Makoko, a group of volunteers organizes literacy classes on a floating platform made from salvaged timber. In Inlay, a cooperative has experimented with solar pumps to bring water to higher beds when necessary. Such initiatives are humble, incremental, and crucial. They demonstrate that adaptation is rarely a single invention, but a mosaic of small, context-sensitive practices. The human dimension is never purely technical. Generational tensions ripple across these communities. Elders who remember when channels were narrower and catches fuller versus youth who see migration to cities as the only avenue to education and stability. A teenager in Ganvi says she would like to study nursing in the city, then come back with knowledge to help her family. Her aspiration is not a rejection of place so much as an attempt to carry home into a broader toolkit. Climate change is the backdrop, slow-moving and accelerating, that reframes every gesture. It appears not as a dramatic event in many of these places, but as a parameter shift. Higher baseline tides, more erratic storms, salt that creeps into fresh soils. Policy decisions and global emissions sit at the headwaters of local vulnerability. Yet the solutions must be local in practice. There is urgency in that juxtaposition. While international negotiations inch forward, people who live at water's edge are forced into immediate choices about what to preserve, what to abandon, and what to retrofit. Yet even in the accounts of loss, there is a quiet insistence on dignity. Ritual continues. Musicians on stilts tune banjos tuned to the rhythm of waves. Elders perform blessing ceremonies that invoke ancestors and weather in the same breath. Children invent games that map out channels like secret cartographies. Culture becomes a resource of resilience, not a nostalgic footnote. It is the knowledge of where to tie a boat, when to harvest certain algae, how to read a wind shift, and how to negotiate with outsiders that shape survival. The tension between tradition and modernity tends to produce paradoxes. Tourism brings revenue and exposure, but can hollow out the practices it commodifies. Floating luxury developments suggest scalability and engineering solutions, but raise bitter questions about distribution. Some projects emphasize community ownership of new platforms, co-designed with residents. Others replicate patterns of displacement under a new envelope. The moral calculus is rarely simple. The choice between technological optimism and cultural preservation must be navigated with humility. There are hopeful innovations that blend both. Cooperative ownership models for floating farms, community-run microgrids powering desalination, and social enterprises that connect artisanal fishers directly to urban markets, reduce middlemen, and stabilize incomes. Where governance allows, land rights are being reframed to include water territories, not merely threat mitigation, but a recognition that rights must track practices as well as property lines. These legal and institutional adjustments are slow but significant because infrastructure without recognition of claims often becomes yet another instrument of exclusion. The climax of such a survey is not a single image, but a braided tension. The physical threat of rising seas and intensified storms, the social threat of displacement or marginalization, and the moral imperative of choosing futures that are just. The resilience found in South Asian lakes, West African lagoons, and Southeast Asian bays offers patterns. Decentralize control where possible. Invest in locally adapted technologies. Fund education that respects and transmits traditional ecological knowledge. Create legal frameworks that recognize mobile and water-based lifeways. As dusk falls on a floating village, lanterns are lit and their reflections tremble like a congregation of stars. A woman who has spent her life on stilts ties her net and says, simply, that the water has taught her to be patient. She doesn't mean resignation, she means rhythm and responsiveness. Across the map, another elder in the shadow of a towering proposed project reads a booklet about city plans and folds it back with care, considering how to speak in an upcoming meeting. These small acts, tending nets, attending consultations, building a raft, are how communities enact agency. In the end, the water holds a mirror up to collective choices. It shows what is already at risk and what might be possible if ingenuity is combined with justice. A world where floating neighborhoods are not only for the wealthy, where coastal defenses are designed with the needs of informal settlements in mind, where the knowledge of sea nomads informs sustainable fisheries management, and where the voices of the marginalized are present at the table where options are decided. We close with the metaphor of crossing. Humanity has always been a people in transit, moving across waterways, trading, learning, and occasionally rebuilding. The places where people live on the water remind us that adaptation is less about a single technological fix than about a continuous, collective practice of care for environments, for neighbors, and for the fragile institutions that can hold societies together through change. If this journey moved you, subscribe to the channel, like and share this story, and take a moment to reflect. What kind of future should we demand for communities who live with water as kin? Learn more, support organizations that work for equitable adaptation, and use your voice to advocate for policies that censor dignity as much as engineering. What follows is less a catalog than a set of modest practices that, when braided together, change the arithmetic of risk. First, design with, not for. In places where new platforms rose from concrete plans drawn in distant offices, residents felt those platforms as impositions, elevated islands whose railings marked class lines. Where designers began by listening, the result looked different. Homes that could be reconfigured by families, public decks where fish were sold and children learned to swim, communal storage for nets and engines placed where the current naturally sheltered boats. Co-design meetings happen at low tide, with elders sketching in the silt and youth testing small prototypes on makeshift rafts. The technical choices are important, but the process, shared decisions, iterative feedback, local maintenance determines whether an intervention becomes infrastructure or another source of exclusion. Second, diversify livelihoods around water, not away from it. For decades, policy prescriptions urged relocation to safer ground. Of course, some moves are necessary, but wholesale abandonment of water-based economies often severs the very skills that kept communities alive for generations. Successful programs expand the portfolio of income rather than replace it. Cold chain storage and value-added processing that let small fishers fetch fairer prices. Floating nurseries for edible and medicinal plants that extend seasonal earnings. Communally run ferry services that connect markets without surrendering residents on water. These approaches accept risk as a shared condition to manage, not a problem to erase by dispossessing people. Third, finance from longevity. Short-term grants seed experiments, long-term funding sustains them. Blended finance, mixing philanthropic grants, concessional loans, and public investment, has underwritten cooperative boatyards and communal desalination systems. Crucially, the terms must favor local control. When loan schedules require rapid repayment, or when donor timelines impose quick, visible outputs, projects tilt towards spectacle. Patient capital allows slow learning. A cooperative that spends 3 years building trust before scaling. A school that pilots a floating curriculum aligned to local knowledge. A legal clinic that helps families document water use claims over a decade. Fourth, codify water rights in ways that recognize mobility. Land tenure systems built around fixed plots struggle to accommodate fishing families who seasonally shift camps, or households that live half the year on rafts and half on shore platforms. Legal experiments in several countries have recognized usufruct-like rights over water territories, conditional permissions anchored to stewardship responsibilities. These arrangements are not a panacea. They require monitoring, dispute resolution mechanisms, and guardrails against commodification. But they break the binary that says either you have title or you are invisible. Fifth, center caregivers and women. Gender shapes experience of flood and displacement in intimate ways. Women often manage household food security, care for children and elders, and maintain informal economies. When adaptation projects include women in leadership, cooperative boards, technical training, budget decisions, the outcomes in safety and equity improve measurably. This is not token inclusion, it is restructuring of power. In one lagoon community, women organized the floating kindergarten that doubled as a processing hub during harvests, stabilizing both childcare and income. Sixth, sustain the knowledge lifeways transmit. Schools that teach reading and arithmetic but treat navigation, seasonal cues, and fish behavior as extracurricular miss an opportunity. Integrative curricula, local language literacy paired with boat handling, tide reading, and basic maintenance produce youth who can move between town economies and water economies. Elders, given honor and modest stipends, become instructors and guardians of an ecological memory that satellite data alone cannot replace. Seventh, designed for ecological resilience. Hard seawalls displace wave energy elsewhere. Mangrove restoration, living shorelines, and seagrass beds absorb tides and provide nurseries. Where engineers work with ecologists and fishers, combined solutions emerge. Breakwaters that double as reef substrates, raised gardens that filter runoff, and drainage channels that channel stormwater into managed wetlands. These are not cheap. They require political will to fund nature-based defenses as social infrastructure. None of this eliminates tension. New infrastructures invite new forms of speculation. Market access can create middlemen who siphon profits. Tourism can fetishize authenticity while erasing daily life. Well-intended pilots can ossify into projects that no longer adapt. The steady work, then, is building adaptive governance. Councils with rotating representation, transparent budgeting, accessible dispute mechanisms, and the capacity to revise choices seasonally. Adaptive governance treats rules as experiments, not decrees. And always, humility. Engineering alone cannot answer the historical injustices that shape vulnerability. Neither can social programs heal the loss of autonomy after decades of exclusion. We must be careful. If we get docks for visitors, we must insist on rules about who sells, when visitors may approach, and where boats may tie. Elias, the engineer who had started as a volunteer and stayed because his calculations could not ignore the stubborn logic of the place, unrolls a sheet stamped with diagrams. He speaks of breakwaters seeded with coral units, of channels that slow surge and feed sediment back into marsh pockets. He speaks the language of load and tide, but his hands translate it into a model of porosity, structures that breathe, not walls that crush. What we need, he says, is a set of pilot interventions, not a wall, a set of living defenses that can be inspected and adapted every season. We build, we watch, we change. He looks at Maria, and his eyes ask the question that his plans alone cannot answer. Will this be done with you or to you? The question hangs there like a gull's cry. The council is an invention of necessity. 10 names on a list that trade between fisher, teacher, healer, elder, youth representative, and 2 women who run the market co-op. Seats rotate after a harvest cycle. That is the rule they wrote with charcoal and a borrowed legal aid's patience. Rotation, transparency, an ombudsperson from outside the kinship webs to assist when disputes would otherwise undo kin. But what if the ombudsperson is from the city, asks Lolo, whose hands are scarred but whose smile is quicker than his patience? They will not know the smell of the mud when the wind shifts. They will not know how we tie the nets. They will demand reports that need paper we do not keep. Maria taps a storyboard showing the cycles of the moon beside the migration lines of a shrimp. Then we teach them. We teach them the calendar. We insist stipend for the elders. We put the elders in the training rooms as teachers of the tides. We make sure any external money is accounted for in our ledger that is open to the whole community. Reina brings up the floating kindergarten as proof of another principle. When women lead, the solutions change shape. We cannot simply add chairs to a table where decisions are made, she says. We must remake the table. When our children learn to paddle, they learn a different map of the town. When our cooperatives sign a contract, the profits are divided by need, not by who speaks loudest. We want to pilot the compost raised beds along the promenade, but we will not do it unless the budget includes pay for those who garden and for someone to teach seed saving. If you want our labor, you must honor it. They argue over line items and time frames. They argue about the spore of middlemen who would position themselves between fisher and buyer. There is talk of a minimal legal framework that could recognize usufruct-like rights to fishing lanes and garden plots, one that does not confer speculative title but secures the right to steward. Miguel suggests a registry, simple and local, with witnesses and a transparent record kept in the market house. Elena, who handles the co-op books, argues for digital receipts, but they decide on paper first because paper can be read without a battery, because an elder can trace signatures with a shaky finger and see they belong to a neighbor. A younger man, Rami, brings up the school curriculum. He has returned recently from a regional teachers workshop and carries ideas about accreditation. He is eager and nervous. If our kids can be certified to do boat maintenance and basic navigation, he says, they can move between job markets. But certification must not mean they leave. We must create ties that make leaving a choice, not a necessity. They decide on a hybrid curriculum, arithmetic and language that anchor to local professions. They will invite elders like Teta Rosa to teach the tidal signs and boat mending as part of the term. They will create a small stipend to pay those teachers, funded by a sliding levy on the market, managed by an account with rotating signatories. The rotating signatory model wins applause, a simple resistance to capture. The conversation moves to dispute resolution. The village remembers the night a fisherman from across the channel accused another of stealing a net. The argument escalated until the boats were braided with anger more than rope. They decide on a small court of 5, chosen by lot from lists of volunteers and elders, with one youth and one woman always present. If the parties cannot agree, the ombudsperson is called. If required, a mediator from the next lagoon can be asked in, because sometimes neighbors understand neighbors better than distant advisors. When the subject of funding arrives, the mood tightens. Grants arrive like tides, regular or sudden, sometimes helpful, often conditional on flashy results. A visiting foundation had offered money for a waterfront promenade if the village agreed to open a boardwalk restaurant. The money was tempting and cruel. They remembered the day the foundation director wore clean shoes and offered glossy promises that would not wash. We will not let their timeline be our calendar, Reina says. If a funder insists on deadlines that break cycles of planting, we refuse. So they create a funding clause. Any external grants must be signed with a covenant that includes 1. A schedule aligned with seasonal labor, 2. Protections against resale of common infrastructure, 3. A clause for revising the project after 2 harvest cycles, and 4. A mechanism for community audit. It is clumsy language at first, scratched in charcoal, yet it functions like salt on a wound, simple, cleaning. Outside, the tide recedes. The pier creaks with the weight of decisions. A child splashes nearby, practicing the first clumsy strokes of a paddle. Above the council, a rack of nets dries, catching the light the way patched sails do. For a moment, the meeting slides into silence, because the weather is a language the council knows and must heed. A low, gray line not far on the horizon signals a storm building beyond the bay. The sky is not threatening yet. There is no panic, but everyone senses a rehearsal of the season. Decisions made now will be tested soon. Elias folds his diagram and speaks. We will begin with a pilot, a living breakwater here, 2 planted nurseries for mangroves there, and raised beds near the school. We will track sediment and fish returns. We will ask the market to set aside a small contingency fund. We will write the usufruct agreements for the garden patches and the nursery, and we will have elders certify them. If after 1 year the pilot fails us, we will learn and change. Maria places the storyboard showing lunar lines at the center of the table and lays a small coin beside it, a donation from a woman who had sold 2 crab baskets and insisted the money be used for seedlings. The coin glints like a promise, small, honest, communal. They end with no grand celebration, just a roll call, names written on the margin of the folded maps, and a plan to walk the proposed sites after the morning tide. People drift away with tasks. The teacher to the classroom on pontoons, Reina back to the kindergarten to check the children's lunch, Miguel to his nets, Lolo to fetch a plank and a borrowed shovel. The pilot is modest, but collectively held. A budget scratched in charcoal, a registry kept in an old notebook, a rota for council seats, a clause against quick sale. It is the slow architecture of a people who have long practiced making a life in water. As they disperse, a thin rain begins, enough to cool the heat of argument and to make the wooden boards smell freshly cut. The boy who had hauled the net that morning walks by with his single fish wrapped in waxed cloth, offering it to an elder who will share it with neighbors. The elder accepts with both hands, and the gesture is not merely charity, but a thread in the social fabric, the reminder that security is woven as much in morning exchanges as it is in levies or loans. Far off, a container ship outlines the horizon like a slow-moving fact of another world. Here, the village names its facts in the language they know: tide, season, seed, debt measured in days of work, respect counted by whose story is heard. They have begun to change the terms by which they are known. They have begun to make small rules that refuse erasure. The water keeps replying, as it always does, patient, indifferent, necessary. It accepts their stakes and returns their planks. It tests the young nurseries and offers up new shoals where the mangroves take hold. It can be cruel, and it can be generous. The council knows this, which is why their work will be not a one-time act, but the kind of governance that wears well with salt. That is to say, a governance that knows how to be mended after storms and how to give room for new hands. They move into the day, carrying with them the smell of brine and the maps folded like prayers. The pilot will not answer all the old injustices. It will ask for patience, it will require personal risk, and it will demand that those who help be held to account. But when the storm that was spoken of finally arrives, sometime next season, they will test not only their breakwaters and floating beds, but the sturdiness of the rules they made together. The rotation, the stipends, the elder signatory, the covenants with funders. Those rules are small things. They are the quiet scaffolding of dignity. On the way to the kindergarten, Reina pauses and watches a line of schoolchildren following the teacher across a narrow walkway, paddles tapping the water like tiny metronomes. She smiles, then turns back toward the market, where Elena waits with the ledger. The day will be busy. The water will continue to speak in tides, and in fish, and in storms. The council will continue to answer, imperfectly and insistently, season upon season.